My name is Daniel Foster, and for 11 years I lived in a quiet development called Willow Creek Estates, on a 5-acre lot at the very edge of the community, where the manicured lawns gave way to old oak trees and a stretch of land that had belonged to my family long before the subdivision existed. My grandfather built a barn on that land back in the 1970s, a simple red structure with a tin roof, used first for hay and tools, and later, after I inherited the property, as my woodworking shop and storage space. That barn had stood for over 40 years without a single complaint. Then the HOA got a new board president, and everything changed. Her name was Deborah Whitfield, though within a month of her taking over, half the neighborhood was quietly calling her the HOA Karen behind her back. She drove a white SUV with a magnetic sign on the door that said, Willow Creek Estates, Community Standards Committee, which wasn't even an official HOA vehicle. She just made the sign herself. She measured grass height with an actual ruler. She once sent a violation notice to a family because their mailbox flag was, in her words, aesthetically inconsistent with the approved color palette. I should have known trouble was coming when she started walking the property line near my barn with a clipboard, taking photos and making notes. I waved to her once. She didn't wave back. She just wrote something down and kept walking. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was printed on HOA letterhead, stamped urgent in red ink, and it informed me that my barn was in violation of Willow Creek Estates Architectural Guidelines, Section 4.2, which stated that all outbuildings must be pre-approved by the Community Standards Committee before construction. It demanded that I submit retroactive paperwork within 30 days or face fines and potential legal action. I remember reading that letter twice, standing in my kitchen, feeling something between confusion and disbelief. The barn had been built decades before the HOA even existed. Willow Creek Estates wasn't incorporated until 1998. My grandfather's barn went up in 1974. There was no possible way it needed HOA approval, because there was no HOA to approve anything at the time. I called the HOA office and got Deborah herself on the phone. I explained the timeline calmly. I told her the barn predated the community by over 2 decades, and that grandfather clause protections, which existed in nearly every HOA's governing documents, would apply. That's not how I see it, she said. The barn is unsightly. It's not consistent with our community standards. And frankly, Mr. Foster, I think you've been taking advantage of the fact that no one on the previous board bothered to enforce the rules properly. That ends with me. I tried to explain that a structure built before an HOA's founding documents were even filed couldn't retroactively require approval that didn't exist yet. She wasn't interested. She told me I had 30 days to comply, or she would bring it to the board for a formal enforcement vote. Over the next 2 months, the letters kept coming. Every week there was something new. The barn's roof color didn't match the neighborhood palette. The barn was allegedly a fire hazard due to its proximity to the tree line. The barn violated setback requirements, even though it had stood in that exact spot since before the HOA's plat maps were even drawn. Each letter came with a new fine attached, stacking up despite my repeated attempts to explain the situation. I hired a lawyer for a consultation, and he told me plainly that as long as the barn was there before the HOA's covenants were recorded, and as long as it hadn't been substantially modified since, I likely had a strong grandfather clause defense. But he also warned me that HOAs sometimes act first and get challenged in court later, because most homeowners don't have the time, money, or willpower to fight back. Deborah Whitfield, it seemed, was banking on exactly that. At the next HOA board meeting, I stood up during the open comment period and explained everything. The history of the barn, the timeline, the grandfather clause, the fact that this had never been an issue for 11 years under 3 previous board presidents. I brought photos from the 1970s. I brought my grandfather's original property deed. Several neighbors nodded along, clearly sympathetic. But Deborah sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, and when I finished speaking, she simply said, "Sentimentality isn't a legal defense, Mr. Foster. The board will vote." They voted 3-2 in favor of enforcement. I later found out that Deborah had personally lobbied 2 of the newer board members before the meeting, painting me as an entitled homeowner who thought the rules didn't apply to him. The vote authorized the HOA to issue a formal demolition order, giving me 60 days to tear the barn down myself or have the HOA contract it out and place a lien on my property for the cost. I was stunned. 11 years of peaceful living in this neighborhood, and now I was being told to destroy a structure that had been part of my family's land for half a century. All because one woman with a clipboard and a superiority complex had decided my barn offended her sense of order. That night, I sat on my back porch looking at the barn silhouetted against the sunset, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight this with anger. I was going to fight it with facts. If Deborah Whitfield wanted to talk about boundaries and property lines, I was going to give her exactly that. The next morning, I called a licensed land surveyor, a company that had done work for my family before, and I asked them to conduct a full boundary survey of my property, including the exact footprint of the barn relative to the property lines described in my deed and in the HOA's own plat maps. I told them I needed it done properly, with official documentation, because I suspected something didn't add up. It took about 3 weeks for the survey crew to complete their work. They used GPS equipment, they cross-referenced county records, they pulled the original 1970s plat filings from the county recorder's office, and they compared everything against the current HOA community map that had been recorded when Willow Creek Estates was developed in 1998. When the surveyor called me with the results, I could hear something like restrained excitement in his voice. "Mr. Foster," he said, "you're going to want to sit down for this." According to the survey, when Willow Creek Estates was originally platted in 1998, the developer had made an error in the boundary description between your parcel and the HOA's designated common area buffer zone. The line had been drawn nearly 40 feet off from where it should have been, based on the original county survey markers from the 1970s. That error had been copied forward into every HOA map since, including the one Deborah Whitfield had been using when she claimed my barn violated setback requirements. But here was the real twist. The error didn't just misplace the barn. It also meant that a strip of land the HOA had long claimed as common area, a strip that ran along the back of several properties, including Deborah Whitfield's own house, actually belonged, according to the original recorded deed, to me. My grandfather's deed, filed decades before the HOA plat, described the true boundary line, and that line placed not just my barn, but a chunk of what the HOA considered shared community space, squarely on my private property. In other words, the barn wasn't just legally grandfathered in, it was sitting entirely on land that was, and always had been, mine. And the HOA had been the one trespassing on the miscalculated buffer zone for over 2 decades, not the other way around. I asked the surveyor to put everything in a formal, certified report, complete with the historical deed references, the county recorder's stamped documents, and a clear comparison map showing the discrepancy between the HOA's plat and the actual legal boundary. I wanted this airtight before I brought it anywhere near Deborah Whitfield or the HOA board. I also called my lawyer back and shared the survey findings. He was thrilled. "This isn't just a defense against the demolition order anymore," he told me. "This is a potential claim against the HOA for improperly using land that was never theirs to claim, possibly for over 20 years. Armed with the certified survey, I requested to be placed on the agenda for the next HOA board meeting. This time, not as a homeowner pleading his case, but as someone with documented legal standing. Word must have spread beforehand, because the meeting room was more crowded than usual. I recognized several neighbors who had also received strange violation letters from Deborah over the past year. People with their own stories about disputed fence heights, questioned landscaping choices, and mailbox flag controversies. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, laid the certified survey report on the table in front of the board, and calmly explained what the documents showed. I described the 1998 platting error, the 40-foot discrepancy, and the fact that my grandfather's original 1970s deed, legally filed and recorded with the county, established the true property line. I explained that my barn, the very structure the HOA had ordered demolished, sat entirely within my legal property boundary, a boundary that predated the HOA's founding by over 2 decades. Then I explained the second part, the part that made the room go completely silent. I explained that the same survey revealed the HOA's so-called common area buffer zone, including sections behind several homes on that side of the neighborhood, including Deborah Whitfield's own backyard, actually extended onto land that belonged to me, and in some sections to my neighbors, not to the HOA at all. Deborah's face went pale, then red. She tried to argue that the survey had to be flawed, that the HOA's official plat map was the governing document, and that a private survey couldn't simply override it. My lawyer, who I'd asked to attend, calmly explained that under state property law, An original recorded deed generally takes precedence over a later plat map when there's a documented discrepancy, especially when the deed predates the plat by decades, and the boundary markers used in the survey matched the original county recorder filings exactly. One of the board members, a soft-spoken man named Harold, who had been on the board for years before Deborah took over, asked to see the documents directly. He looked through them carefully, flipping between the certified survey and the printed HOA plat map that Deborah had been citing in every violation letter she'd sent me. After a long pause, he looked up and said, "She's right. Look at these coordinates. Our map has been wrong this whole time." The room erupted into murmurs. Other homeowners who had received violation letters from Deborah over things near that same boundary line started pulling out their phones, asking whether their properties might be affected too. It turned out I wasn't the only one. At least 4 other homes along that stretch had received warnings or fines related to structures or landscaping near that same miscalculated buffer zone. Structures that, based on the corrected boundary, were also entirely on private land. The board called for an emergency vote to rescind the demolition order against my barn, pending a full independent review of the community's boundary maps. It passed unanimously, including Deborah's vote, though she looked like she'd rather have chewed glass than raise her hand. But the story didn't end there, because once the corrected boundary lines became public knowledge among the homeowners, people started asking harder questions about how Deborah Whitfield had been enforcing rules so aggressively on a boundary that, it turned out, the HOA had never actually had proper legal claim to. Some neighbors requested a formal review of every violation notice issued during her time as board president. It turned out several other fines and demolition threats she had pushed through, including one against an elderly couple's garden shed and another against a young family's newly built fence, were also based on the same flawed plat map, structures sitting comfortably within homeowners' actual legal property lines. A special HOA meeting was called a few weeks later, this time specifically to address a vote of no confidence in Deborah Whitfield's leadership. I attended, though I didn't speak much. I didn't need to. Neighbor after neighbor stood up and described their own run-ins with her, the aggressive letters, the selective enforcement, the way she seemed to relish handing out fines, rather than fostering the kind of community the HOA was supposedly meant to protect. Harold, the board member who had first cross-checked my survey, spoke last. He said something I still remember clearly. An HOA is supposed to protect property values and community harmony. It's not supposed to be a weapon used against the very people it's meant to serve. We forgot that somewhere along the way, and I think it's time we remembered it. The vote to remove Deborah Whitfield from the board passed with an overwhelming majority. She resigned formally the following week, before the paperwork could even be finalized, and moved out of Willow Creek Estates entirely about 4 months later. I heard through neighbors that she'd taken a similar volunteer position on another HOA board across town, though I never confirmed it. And honestly, I felt a little bad for whoever ended up living under her clipboard next. As for the barn, it's still standing. I repainted the tin roof last spring, the same barn red it's always been, and I added a small brass plaque near the door that says, "Established 1974, partly as a joke and partly as a quiet reminder of everything that happened. The corrected property survey is now filed permanently with the county, and the HOA's plat maps were officially amended the following year to reflect the true boundary lines, a process that took months of surveyors, lawyers, and a fair amount of paperwork, but which ultimately gave several of us homeowners a little more land and a lot more peace of mind than we'd had before." Looking back on everything, I think about how close I came to just giving in. I think about how many homeowners across the country probably have received similar demolition orders, similar aggressive violation letters, similar overreach from HOA board members who mistake authority for ownership, and who simply comply out of exhaustion or fear of legal costs, without ever checking whether the underlying claims were even accurate in the first place. If I hadn't ordered that survey, if I hadn't pushed back and asked for the actual documentation behind the HOA's demands, I might have torn down a barn that had stood on my family's land for 50 years, based entirely on a mapping error that nobody had bothered to double-check in over 2 decades. The lesson I took from all of it is a simple one. Authority isn't the same as accuracy. Just because someone hands you an official-looking letter with a red urgent stamp and a deadline doesn't mean everything written on it is true. Boundaries matter, paperwork matters, and sometimes the person waving the clipboard the loudest is the one who's actually standing on the wrong side of the line. These days, Willow Creek Estates has a new HOA president, a retired school teacher named Carol who actually reads the governing documents before sending out violation notices, and who insists on independent verification before any enforcement action is taken. The community feels different now, calmer, fairer. My neighbors wave at each other again instead of nervously checking their mailboxes for red-stamped envelopes. And every now and then, when I'm out in the barn working on a new woodworking project, I glance over at that little brass plaque by the door, and I think about how close I came to losing something that was never really in danger to begin with. Not legally, not once the truth came out. The HOA Karen ordered my barn demolished, convinced she had the authority and the documentation to back it up. But in the end, it was her own map that was wrong, and it was the truth, buried in an old 1970s survey, dusted off and brought back into the light, that saved not just my barn, but reshaped the entire neighborhood's understanding of where the real boundaries had always been.